Welcome to Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell. This is the place where we dive into the world of talent acquisition, explore the challenges of today's workplace, and discover what it takes to build a thriving and successful organization.
Thanks for joining me once again for my conversation with Miranda Zolot, the General Counsel at Oyster, where she's building a legal framework to simplify compliant global hiring. And in part one, Miranda, you outlined your approach to streamlining compliant hiring worldwide. Now let's dive deeper into navigating labor laws across borders. Regulations vary by country, but workplace culture is equally important. How can companies follow local laws while respecting cultural norms?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because we're often asked at Oyster, we know what the law is, but what's custom? What is typical? And often what is typical and custom is beyond what the statutory requires. And this includes wages and time worked. There are instances where local laws allow for different types of work, for longer hours, and you need to understand kind of what that nuance is. Whether or not you will necessarily be able to capture the talent you want by being compliant is a real dilemma in some parts of the world.
Yeah, if you're a Western-based company and you have these expectations of your shareholders or of your public persona, and yet in some other part of the world, that is not the expectation whatsoever, how do you manage that?
Yeah, and what I would say is that we typically suggest that you understand what matters for your shareholders and what matters to you as a business. And typically you will find that a business will either focus on maximizing profits or margins or whatever it may be, or they may focus on an employee experience or brand and brand marketing, where they sit in the ESG sphere, for instance. And if you do want to be someone who is considered the friendly employer, the employee-centric employer, then you might have to respond to what your shareholders in their culture require and not necessarily bottom line. But that's not the calculus that everyone makes. And it is truly a business decision for those executives, those board members. And it's a tricky one because for instance, we have folks who get paid a lot more. We have customers that pay their team members a lot more than they necessarily would make on the local economy, but they work less hours. So they have managed to navigate this instance by paying a slightly higher rate. They get the talent they want, and it's not poached by the other Western outfit, frankly, that's literally across the street trying to get their talent. But that $2 more an hour, which actually is probably generous, it's probably more like an hour, $1 more per hour, allows them to have the talent they want. The talent actually then works a little bit less. They realize it's kind of an interesting chicken and egg. They realize, it's better if I actually do work a little bit less. And then you sort of engender this different calculus with the employees, and they start looking at, okay, well, now I want X dollars for X amount of work. And it makes it kind of an interesting dynamic for the local talent. But you absolutely will compete on those local levels culturally, what your shareholders want to do and what the locals will or will not do, and those local nationals and what's customary isn't always the same.
So when we think about global employees, what kind of compliance training is important for global employees to understand their rights?
So I would say what is required is going to vary depending on the state or the jurisdiction that you're talking about. What I think is important as for global companies generally is understanding respect. And these are training modules that are kind of tricky, actually, because you're not going to necessarily be able to out of the box find cultural respect. I think we're getting better, but that matters. understanding and being open to other people's cultures and their norms and what they expect so that you don't make judgments without understanding the context of what went into that is very important. You need to really understand wage and hour requirements. And while you're not going to necessarily teach everyone each requirement, you need people to understand that there are very specific expectations of people's times and what you can and can't do in that work time. And we in America have a very different perspective of what that looks like than a lot of the world. And so we need to make sure to kind of check that expectation and what we think of success and ambition and hard work looks like, because it's not necessarily the same place to place. So I think really understanding that is important, and that you have to respect those wage and hour laws. And if it says you can't, expect an email, don't expect an email, and you can't, ding that person for not responding to that email. That's really hard culturally sometimes to get managers to understand. And then I would say just generally, there is a discrimination harassment piece. Different countries will call it different things. You have bullying in some countries, you have harassment in others, discrimination in pretty much everywhere, but really understanding that we do need to think about our employee talent pool as an entire talent pool. And while you can't compare apples to oranges, they're all fruit. And so you're going to need to make some adjustments to perhaps the way you set expectations. And I think the best way to do that is just to really forward transparency in your organization. Be transparent about what pay bands are. Be transparent about what it takes to move from one position to another. Be really clear about your travel policies, because that's a big one that we have to deal with. Like, you can't just go to Bali because they have internet there and you got a flight. It doesn't work that way. And really being clear about your expectations and communicating those and having them available for folks to reference really helps.
Well, and that's true for even if you're not international. The more clarity you have in all of these processes, just the better culturally you're going to be off, because you can point to it very clearly. Look, we've talked about this from the day you came in. It's documented. We know what the expectations are, but
absolutely. And where everything else is different, right? When you have jurisdictional differences everywhere, the clearer you can be about your expectations, be it performance, be it time schedules, whatever that is, it's going to go a really long way towards building trust with your employees and helping them understanding that you're just trying to do the best by them and they're trying to do the best by you, and you will succeed together. It does really help.
So we've talked about several different compliance challenges. If you could wave a magic wand and say, here's the one thing, if I could just fix this one thing, it would just, there's so much room for improvement in this area. What would be the compliance practice area for global hiring? Let's say that this is where we see problems all the time. What is it? Can you pick one that people just don't miss out on this? People, we need to fix this. There's a lot of challenges here.
So I would say that the compliance challenge that is the biggest challenge that causes the most headache is when you are offboarding an employee anywhere outside of the US. At the conclusion of the engagement, there is very little understanding for most folks, or very little care to do it right for most folks, that really respect the fact that in almost every culture, exiting an employee is something that you do over time and with dignity, and that the point of performance reviews is to actually improve the performance of the individual, not to exit them. When someone is not performing, you are supposed to bring them along, and it is your duty to help them be successful. What I would say is this fundamental misunderstanding that this is what an employer's role is creates a lot of challenges. It is where people end up in litigation. It is where people end up spending a lot of money and still keeping the individuals on. It's where I think that people decide they don't want to go and hire globally because they don't understand how this works and they think it's too hard. And this is not to say that ending an employment relationship internationally is impossible. It is absolutely possible, and people need to be responsible for the work that they've said that they're going to do. But anyone that's working globally, I really wish my magic wand would be to say, like, you are going to get incredible things from a diverse group of workers around the world. You're going to get all kinds of advantages from like around the clock coverage. You're going to get, different perspectives. You're going to get skill set, maybe at a price point that you can't get in your own hometown. You'll be able to get talent that you won't be able to get in your hometown. But the cost of that is you're making a true investment in this person. And they are taking a risk on you as much as you are taking a risk on them. And it's not something to be done lightly. So while, like I said, not a compliance challenge per se, it is a true business operating challenge.
That's brilliant. I really appreciate that thought. It's thought-provoking for sure as I think about, the various places that I've seen organizations work. And often companies will go into a place, they're like, oh, it's a cost benefit thing. Or like you said, I can't find the talent anywhere else. I'm just going to go use that. But there's a commitment on behalf of the company to the individual, just as the contract is a commitment back. It's a two-way agreement, not a one-way.
It is. But if you're willing to say, okay, I'm going to try this, the market for talent around the world is amazing. I'm continually impressed by the people that I meet around the globe and the work that they do and their just excitement to be involved in work from employers that allow them to stay in their hometowns, in their home countries, to kind of have the best of both worlds, have that really challenging employment opportunity, grow their horizons, learn, but also, be where they're comfortable and, where they might have other obligations that keep them there. I don't know. It's a great market to tap.
It is. It's great that we can even have the opportunity to do it now. So let me get you to be, if you can, a little bit more specific. Can you share an example of a creative solution that you've designed to a complex compliance challenge? Leaving names out, but just to give people a real flavor of something that was challenging, but here's a creative way to approach it.
Sure. So let's say you've committed to being international. You've committed to hiring a person in a place where you don't have business. You want to offer them equity, and you can't necessarily do it because your plan doesn't allow provision of equity to this particular service provider because they're not an employee and they don't qualify as a service provider under the terms of your stock plan. We have worked, and you can work with vendors to create a cash equity plan, or it's sometimes called phantom stock, where you provide the incentives that you would to your internal employees as far as the equity and advancement of the company through different means. So that is something that, some people think, oh, well, I can't give them a piece of the company, but they're really important to me and I want them to understand that. There are ways that you can do that in other jurisdictions, even if your current plan doesn't allow that. There's a lot of problems, but they're not really problems because there's a solution to everything.
Maybe that's a quick takeaway that we should have. While you may think your problem is insurmountable, there's an answer. There's a way to get through it.
There is. And what I will tell you is there is an answer for everything, but there's no necessarily risk-free option.
Yeah, you don't necessarily get the answer you want, but there is an answer.
Right. But so what I would say is one of the things that people come to us, and we talked about it briefly, okay, at a certain point, your contacts with the country become too heavy. And there is a risk that you will be considered to be operating in that place. You have to pay corporate taxes. What happens then? There are ways that you can change your operations. You can, one thing that we've seen folks do is they purposefully have sales folks in one region that are selling into another region to avoid any contacts with that particular region. So that's a way you can solve that problem. But at a certain point, the new region that they're selling into will be like, wow, this salesperson is amazing. And where are our taxes? So you're not going to necessarily, if you're really successful, you're not going to outrun your success, which is a good thing. But it means that there are consequences to that. You can use an EOR, Oyster, all the time. And our competitors were happy to help folks try things out in a very low risk way, but it's never without risk. And that's something that I think is really
low
important.
Doesn't mean zero.
Low doesn't mean zero. And anyone that tells you that it is probably, selling you it's probably something that's a little bit too good to be true. But there are really low risk ways of trying things out. That would be something that I would encourage folks to do if they are looking for, if it's a particular market and they are concerned about compliance concerns, if they're concerned about data privacy. That's one of those things, like I didn't mention it as my biggest concern ever, but data privacy is a thing. And every jurisdiction is racing to provide their own version of rules about how to manage data. It's a lot to manage. It's a lot to keep straight. And sometimes it's easier if you don't have to if you don't have to keep the rules for Brazil distinct from the rules from the UK versus the rules for Ireland. And that's true with a lot of these elements. If you are trying to keep track on a spreadsheet or through a system of the various laws from country to country, it can be paralyzing because it's so much. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways around it, and there aren't vendors that can help you. There aren't partners you can find that can help educate you about them. And that's really
this aspect of the world, their expertise, their business.
Exactly. And it's one of those things, like if I had to do it all over again, like I can't imagine trying to build this out and maintain it for my company.
Yeah, focus on what your company does and
exactly.
Focus on the thing that they do.
Exactly. And there are, like I said, now a lot less barriers to that, which is wonderful.
So let me combine these next two questions into one if I can, because I think they may overlap a little bit. So I wanted to ask about how compliance has evolved throughout your time as an in-house counsel, but then as you described that, the evolution, what are some of the emerging trends or changes that people should prepare for? Things that you see on the horizon that are coming, that maybe they ought to be, that they may have, if they've had some experience, these may be new.
So things that are changing with compliance, I would say we're operating, it's kind of a bigger question, but what I would say is we're operating in a digital world, and our laws are like analog. They don't meet up at all. The reality and sort of the regulation. What we're seeing across the board are not new laws. We're seeing countries trying to enforce antiquated laws and not finding a way forward to recognize these new ways of working. That's really challenging.
So like taxing people based on cartwheels as opposed to on transportation via air travel or something like that.
Yes. Well, we talked about traveling. Let's say you have someone who does a remote work and they travel. We all struggled with this at the beginning of the pandemic when people were trying to find their employees just to find out that they were like half the country away, half the world away. Trying to find your employees and then figure out how to tax them was a problem. That problem has not gone away. And while during the pandemic, the countries and the nationalities were like willing to kind of like hold their breath and see how it settled, we're kind of past that now, and they want their taxes. And it sounds silly, but it is trying to enforce a lack of mobility on a very mobile workforce is really hard, from not only like income tax, but healthcare. How Do you provide healthcare to someone who is spending part of their year in one country and part of their year in another country? And while there are some, agreements in the EU to transfer these obligations, they're not all there. And that only assumes you're moving in and out of the EU in various member states. And that's really complicated. IP is the same way. Each country, and we haven't talked about this really, but each country has their own intellectual property rules. If you have someone working in one country, but all of a sudden they've, kind of gone somewhere else to work, what happens to the IP? Does it become IP of that person because in that particular location, the maker, the person that develops it, gets the IP automatically? It's really tricky. And you wouldn't necessarily think about that because you would think,
they've always been here and now they're over in, country X, and country X says, oh, that's yours.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing. And even with our model, like we help companies expand and move, but you might be concerned like, oh, well, does Oyster have our IP? Who has our IP? So making sure that we have created ways and frameworks to transfer IP that meet the old ways of doing things, that don't recognize the current ways of working, that's really the challenge that I see right now for everyone that is in this space, because we're not in an environment where someone walks down the street to the factory. And the reality is most of the laws in the world still have the worker walking down the street to the factory that's owned by this person in the same, geo, and trying to bring regulators up and help change that law, help influence the way that looks for digital visas, if that's what we're looking at, if it's like talking about that tax and how we can exchange those rates and all of those things. That's really the challenge that I see for, folks like us that are in the employment business, but also for the folks that are, looking to kind of just work in this new digital economy that's, like I said, stuck in this analog law space.
Miranda, what do you find most rewarding about leading and managing a diverse legal team?
Learning stuff every day. What I would say is that my favorite thing about leading a global team, and the legal team is in 17 countries. If you think about it, which is kind of crazy. We learn how people think, how people work, even technically, like how a law is written in a certain place. And this goes for anyone's work that they do. Why is it that way in that place? And can we use that information to do it better over here? And that's just an amazing gift. Not to mention you get to see amazing pictures of food from around the world and places where people are visiting. Your life's a lot richer when you can learn from, what other people are doing, both personally and professionally. And that's my favorite part.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and speaking with me and with the entire audience. I really appreciate it. And best of luck to you at Oyster.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
And that puts the wraps on another episode of Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to subscribe and receive notifications for new episodes. Also, if you could spare a minute, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review to help others like yourself discover the show. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.
This has been Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you want to empower your organization to reach new heights, go to johnwmitchell.com to find the techniques and tools you need to attract and retain the best team and boldly reimagine your workplace. Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell is a production of Forbes Books.